The candle had always been a stubborn thing. On stormy evenings, when the town's power hiccuped and the Atlantic pushed cold fingers through cracked window panes, the little flame by Daniel Mercer's front door would stubbornly burn. It was ridiculous, anachronistic, an act of defiance in an era of motion sensors and LED porch lights. Neighbors joked, regulars at the bakery called it Daniel's superstition. Tourists snapped photos, but Daniel kept it. A squat beeswax candle sitting in an iron bowl, its rim blackened with old drips, a soft halo tracing the threshold of his narrow shop on Whitaker Lane. 7 years had taught him two things about hope. It could be fashioned into ritual, and rituals could scab over into habit until the original wound stopped hurting because you stopped looking. Every night at dusk, he lit that candle. Every night he stood for a few minutes with his back against the door, hands buried in the pockets of his wool coat, and listened to the way the town exhaled. He did not know if she would return. He did not know how to stop. The flame made the waiting make sense. On a Tuesday that smelled of rain and cut grass, the candle sputtered, guttered, and then steadied as if obeying a command it had been waiting for. Daniel did not notice at first. He was balancing a small box of vintage camera parts, worrying about an order from a gallery in Boston. The bell over the shop door jingled, the sound thin in the wet air, and then she was there like a scene you'd half remembered from a dream. Standing in the doorway, wet hair clinging to her collar, eyes rimmed red, but flaring with something like indignation. Leila Hart, gone for 7 years, declared missing one autumn when a fire devoured half the warehouses down on Dockside. The town had made space in its gossip columns for 1,000 reasons she might have left, ran away, ran out, wanted a new life. Daniel knew the catalog of whispers. He had added his quiet, more difficult theory into his nights. Maybe she had stayed away to keep him safe. She looked as she had in the photographs he kept, a face he had cut from newspapers and tied into a small, crooked scrap of paper that lived with a tassel on his wall. Different, too. Time had given Leila a kind of careful armor. Her coat was too good for the kind of life she might have chosen. There were flight lines under her eyes like old maps. When she crossed the threshold, the candle breathed brighter. Her fingers brushed the iron rim, lingering, and Daniel realized the ridiculous truth he had never let himself admit. The ritual had never been for the town, or for superstition. It was for her, for the possibility that she might slip back through that doorway and find that something, however small, had been kept for her. Daniel! Her voice cut across racks of film and glass and old Polaroid prints. The name was a stone dropped into a still pond, sound and shape, and then a widening circle that reached out. He set the box of parts down slowly, as if touching something holy. Leila, she smiled, half apology, half surprise, like someone who had expected an empty shop but instead found the exact place where they were supposed to be. The candles light threw small, shivering shadows on her cheekbones. Beyond the windows, the town went about its business. A dog barking in the lane, a delivery truck coughing to life. Inside, the flame and the woman and the man who had kept a vigil for years folded into a silence that smelled of wax and old paper. There was an ache under the small sounds, a question with teeth. Why now? Leila's return unspooled 1,000 more questions than answers. She had returned to the door where a candle burned waiting, but she was not alone. She was being followed by memories that were darker than the town's gossip, and by enemies that wore respectable faces. The thing Daniel had preserved like a talisman might be the first light in a house that needed to be rebuilt, or the match that would set the whole place ablaze. He wanted to ask the simplest thing, "Where have you been?" Instead, the first words that came were smaller, oddly insufficient. "You found the candle." She nodded, a small, strained motion. "I saw the smoke from the alley." "I thought maybe," her sentence broke. She looked at the little bowl and then at him, the past and the present colliding in her gaze. Outside, the rain steadied into a fine spray. The candle's flame steadied too, as if testing its own courage. Daniel had been waiting for her return in the only way he knew how, by refusing to extinguish a light. She had returned on a day when a wind could have snuffed it. That the flame still burned felt like a promise or a trap. When she finally spoke, the words were not simply an explanation. They were a summons. "We need to talk," she said, and in the tilt of her voice there was a warning. "And you need to be careful." He should have been frightened then. He should have gone straight to the police, or called the one friend he kept on speed dial. But the candle had taught him another lesson. Some weights are sacrificial. And by the time Daniel realized the danger threaded through her return, it was already crawling up the steps like smoke. Daniel Mercer believed in small things. He believed, stubbornly and unromantically, that life's truth was not to be found in dramatic gestures, but in the precise fitting of parts. A cleaned gear, an impeccably wound spring, a photograph developed to the right exposure. He ran Mercer and Son, Repair and Curios, a narrow shop that scented Whitaker Lane with faint acetone and lemon oil. The front window displayed folded movie posters, camera bodies with histories, and a handwritten sign offering restorations, film development, watch repairs. The back room smelled of cardboard and sun-warmed pages where he kept a careful archive of every scrap of Leila Hart's life the town had offered to him, an old theater ticket, a pair of gloves, a photograph from a summer fair, each pinned, labeled, and treated with the reverence of reliquaries. At 42, Daniel's body had settled into the kind of uprightness that comes from years of physical work. Hands marked with faint oil scars and knuckles knotted like old tree roots. His hair was banded with early silver at the temples. He was a man who wore practicality like a coat, plain shirts, a leather apron short of tears. It made him invisible in the way a well-made jacket lets you pass through a crowd unnoticed until you take it off. He liked music that smelled faintly of vinyl, food that took time, and solitude that he had carved into schedules. Thursday mornings were for restorations, Saturday afternoons for film development, evenings for walking the shoreline with a thermos of coffee and a cigarette he tried to quit. Daniel was born in this town, the son of a craftsman and a schoolteacher who taught him to value detail and to notice when something was slightly off. There was a gentleness to his routine, what his younger brother called Mercer's tiny empire of order, and underneath it a brittle refusal. He had loved once, he had let someone leave him. After that, he had built walls not from bricks but from appointments. He believed vulnerability to be a kind of sin because it had once led him into a leveling hurt. Since then, his compassion had lived in small acts. Fixing a watch without charging a pensioner, developing a roll of film for a student who couldn't afford the fee, keeping a candle burning on his doorstep for a woman who might, someday, return. Leila Hart was a contradiction, both untamed and fragile, a person who could dissolve a room's attention simply by laughing. In her early 30s, she carried a restless beauty, dark hair often cut short, hands that were always ink-stained, an appetite for questions that made her restless in lectures about anything too tidy. She was an investigative journalist in a world that loved surface stories, and the restlessness had found her digging into docks and warehouses where polite society preferred not to look. People said she had fire in her eyes, and they meant it. She had a habit of asking the wrong people the right questions. Before she disappeared, she had been living on the edge of a career and a relationship with Daniel that was more tender than dramatic. They had loved with a careful intensity born of mutual respect. He loved her curiosity, she loved his steadiness. They had not married, both were ambiguous about grand gestures, but they had made an informal, unadvertised pact of small intimacies. Sunday morning coffee, her reading aloud while he repaired a camera, a plan to travel for a month that always deferred itself in the way plans sometimes do. Their life together did not have a finality to it. It had the shapelessness that could bend under pressure. When she vanished, the town folded its hands and made assumptions. Fire investigators judged the warehouse blaze suspicious but inconclusive. Leila's trail vanished the way smoke does in a wind. Daniel tried to be practical. He filed a missing person report. He put up posters. He spoke to the police. He lit the candle. But the absence changed him in ways that his hands could not fix. He became watchful, prone to staring at empty chairs and incoming footsteps. The archive he kept was a map of what-ifs. Leila's return altered everything about how Daniel had thought the world would return to him. She arrived as someone who had been shaped by things that took the edges off her laugh and wiped the shine from her impatience. She spoke less freely about herself than she used to, and her eyes always scanned a room for an exit, small signs of someone who had learned that appearances can be traps. Her past, when she offered it in fragments, smelled of diesel and late-night typing, of meetings in abandoned loading bays, and the companies she'd looked into with a reporter's ruthless curiosity. She had enemies who had more in common with the city than with the town. A developer with ties to politicians, men who reeked of power, and the ability to obliterate small lives with a single press of a pen. At the beginning of this story, the characters stand on a brittle axis. Daniel, whose life is a quiet litany of repair and ritual. Leila, whose life is a knot of secrets, questions, and dangerous answers. Their needs are straightforward and in some ways contrary. Daniel's need is to keep what he's preserved, the sense of a life left intact. Leila's need is to put right what she broke, to reveal an ugly truth and perhaps atone in a way only she understands. But liability sits between them, danger and choices that might demand sacrifices neither anticipated. Supporting them are a handful of characters who will tilt the axis. Maria Velasquez runs the bakery across the lane. Her warmth is blunt as bread and twice as necessary. Tom Hargreaves is a retired detective who now drinks Earl Grey and keeps to his armchair. He owes Daniel a favor for reasons he can't articulate. There's also a developer, Gideon Pierce, slick, delicately polite, and named in a dozen documents Leila once touched. Old friendships, unexamined resentments, and the memory of the brother Daniel had lost to a betrayal in the past will all intersect, pressuring each main character to either move or harden. Both Daniel and Leila have flaws that nuclear the story's stakes. Daniel's fear of vulnerability has calcified into secrecy. He keeps his grief leashed, convincing himself it is dignity. Leila's bravado, her compulsion to unmask wrongs, blinds her to other people's fragility. She believes truth is a tool sharper than it sometimes is. Their goals, Daniel's to protect the small, human life he keeps. Leila's to finish the story that made her leave, will collide into a story neither of them imagined. And in the middle of it, a candle will keep its vigil. Leila's return should have been a relief. Instead, it acted like a dropped stone in a still pond, waves pushing out farther than Daniel had imagined. A week after she reappeared in his doorway, claiming she had been laying low, Leila pulled him into a small back room that smelled of damp cardboard and fixer's oil and handed him a thin file. In it were photocopied documents, a list of names, a photograph of a dockside ledger with a certain company's seal, and a printed email chain that made Daniel's stomach contract. "She's not missing," Leila said quietly, pointing to one line. "She's been erased." On the page, an account number blinked like a ledger heartbeat. The name attached to the account wasn't a person, it was an LLC, a shell. The money trail led to Gideon Pierce's company, the developer who'd been buying warehouses and pushing small tenants out for years. Leila had followed it, she explained, and found things that made her blood run cold. Payments that went from invisible accounts into the pockets of men who owned the town's political oxygen. When she'd first started to go public, she'd found threats. She'd found men who could make problems happen. She'd backed away, heard rumors of a hit placed on her name, and chosen to vanish if it kept people she loved from being collateral. "Why did you come back?" Daniel asked. It was a foolish question. The file was an answer. She had a story to finish. She had footprints she wanted to expose. She had sworn that the truth would not be catalogued where it could be ignored any longer. "We need proof," Leila said. "We need to connect the ledger to the company accounts. There are papers in the old Pierce office. If we can get those, it ties him to the ring. It exposes him. It gives the police something they can't ignore." Daniel's instinct was caution. The police had not been able to get a conviction on missing persons in years. Businesses like Gideon's had layers of legality that acted like smoke screens. But Leila's eyes had a fevered light. She was not thinking of the small risk of a single man being angry. She was thinking of the damnable irresponsibility of letting something awful go on in such plain sight. "You'll be careful," Daniel said, because that was what he always said to people he loved, as if the world's threats could be warded by the moral rightness of a sentence. "I will be careful," she lied, her mouth pressed into a line. She looked at the candle sitting in its iron bowl near the doorway like a cheek leaning to the wind. "But there's more," she said, folding her hands around the file. "I have been followed." Daniel felt the color drain from his face in a slow, ridiculous tide. He had always hated the idea of being threatened. He had repaired locks and latch systems when friends bought new houses. He had a taste for practical fixes. But followed was a word that lived at a certain pitch in the town, and it made the wallpaper of his life begin to peel. "Who? I don't know," Leila answered. "Two men. One looks like he could belong to any security firm, clean-shaven, navy coat. The other is a little older. He smokes cheap cigars and he has a scar on his knuckle. They're careful. They're professional. They don't speak like criminals. They speak like accountants who keep their hands clean." The CCTV outside his shop had been out of order that morning. Daniel discovered an interesting coincidence. He fixed it with a screwdriver, his hands steady but quick. There was no footage to check. That in itself didn't prove anything. Coincidences happened. But when a delivery driver later told him he'd seen a car idling at the end of the lane, a nondescript black sedan with tinted windows, the rumor of danger started to look less rumor and more map. Then the first real threat arrived. It came in an envelope without a return address, wax-sealed in a way meant to be theatrical. Daniel had found it on the stoop just as he was about to close the shop. A single sheet of paper folded into thirds. Inside were 3 sentences in a printed font that tasted like mockery. "Stop digging. Consider this a kind, gentle warning. People who pry are hurt." There was no signature. The paper smelled faintly of machine oil and something metallic. Daniel carried it inside like an accusation. He held it between thumb and forefinger as if it were a foreign object. His chest bristled with the old instinct to protect, to organize. He wanted to call Tom Hargreaves, the retired detective, and yet another part of him wanted to take the paper and place it, ceremoniously, among the pins on the wall, an entry in the ledger of threats that had become their secret archive. Leila folded the paper with careful fingers and put it in her bag. "We knew it could get worse," she said. "That's not a reason to stop." Daniel wanted to argue, to demand that she go into hiding again. But the look in her eyes was an ember. She had left once because she thought it would keep him safe. She had come back because it was no longer safe for others. When she touched him, briefly, the way she had touched him in that doorway, he felt the weight of what she had decided. Buildings change at the edges when danger moves in. A small town gossip can harden into an accusation that crumbles someone's life. Daniel began to notice things that had once been background. A figure at the pub who watched him a little too often. A letter in his mail that was addressed to Mercer and Son, but contained nothing but white pages. A photograph, delivered anonymously, of Leila standing in front of a warehouse with the Pierce logo faintly visible on a distant truck. The inciting incident was not a single moment, but a crest of many. Leila's return, the file that suggested corruption, the men who followed her, the anonymous note. Together they pushed Daniel out of a life of quiet ritual. He had lit a candle to preserve a possibility. Now the candle's light illuminated evidence, and evidence attracts predators. Tom, when Daniel went to him, listened with the patient professional's attention he saved for things that smelled like trouble. "You don't have to be a hero," Tom said, tapping his cigarette ash into the tray. "You just have to be smart." "We're not heroes," Leila said. "We're just trying to make a record. If Gideon sees us as trouble, he'll act. He'll try to make the problem disappear." Tom's face tightened. He knew Gideon Pierce's name. Everyone did. He'd followed the money trail back to the doorways of men who thought of law as a set of suggestions. If there's proof to tie him to missing persons, if he's laundering money to keep people quiet, then we need to make it public in a way they can't ignore. "The paper said don't dig," Daniel murmured. "We dig anyway." Leila's jaw softened. "We don't dig alone." That admission, her willingness to let him in, was both the riskiest and the most healing thing she could do. It was an offer of trust, a key placed on the counter. Daniel took it, but he also placed a second key on the counter, the candle. He would not let that go without a fight. The first outward movement of this new life came that night, when they planned a break into one of Gideon Pierce's underused offices, a plan that felt reckless and precise. Daniel would disable external alarm lines. Tom would provide eyes from a distance. Leila would get inside with a forged letter of authority she produced like a conjurer's card. The plan had, on paper, a kind of naive genius, and the kind of practical holes that real life loved to shoot through. Still, it felt like movement, like answering a call that had been ringing for too long. They lit the candle together that night, and the flame burned as if hungry for what was coming. Daniel's hands shook a little as he matched Leila's, and the small warmth that radiated from their joined palms was not entirely the room's. Outside in the lane, the black sedan sat and idled, like a moth circling a porch light. They tried to be clever about it, as if planning could outmaneuver the slow, patient appetite of those who had power. In practice, cleverness was a series of compromises and small victories sewn together. The plan to infiltrate Pierce Holdings' lower-tier office was executed on a night when the town's fog came rolling in off the water like a tide. They picked a Tuesday because Gideon liked to be theatrical on Mondays and was less likely to be seen on midweek nights. Tom parked 3 blocks away with binoculars and a hand radio that had the comforting, analog crackle of an era before encrypted cell calls. Daniel brought a toolkit that felt, in its precision, like a prayer. Leila carried the forged letter and a confidence that was more brittle than she let on. Mercer and Son, by day, was a place people trusted to keep old things alive. By night, it became a staging ground for furtive operations. The shop's back room filled with maps and photocopies, a cinema of evidence spread across an old table. Leila marked names she had seen in ledgers, dates that corresponded with disappearances. The map they developed painted a picture of extraction. Small businesses pushed out, warehouses left to half-rot, the vulnerable employed in seasonal work where their absences were easier to bury. When they walked into the Pierce office under the pretense of being auditors, Leila crisp, voice steady, they walked with the confidence of people who believed in the rightness of their cause. Security scanned their IDs. A receptionist asked about their appointment, and they invented one with the ease of practiced liars. The elevator hummed up to a half-lit floor where the carpeting softened footsteps and the smell of lemon-scented cleaner lingered. Inside, the office was less ostentatious than the brochures suggested. Tasteful art on the walls, glass partitions, photographs of Gideon shaking hands with politicians. Underneath the sheen, Daniel's nose for details found a mechanical weak link. An old CCTV server cabinet in a supply closet that was still on analog lines. Leila took the lead, fingers moving as though typing into the wiring's memory. She knew how to read access panels the way other people read novels, searching for the breadcrumb that would betray a truth. Daniel, meanwhile, crawled into the understair crawlspace to find a cable he could tap, hands memorizing the texture of insulation and the way a loose screw felt in the dark. Tom, at the appointed distance, watched the street and watched the seep of night. But Pierce's men did not work like amateurs. Part of the reason Gideon had succeeded was because he paid for competence. The older man with the scar had eyes like a trap. He watched everything as if it was a rehearsal for action. On the third night of their work, as Leila and Daniel sat in the supply closet with files spread like a fan between them, the door opened softly. "You shouldn't be here." The man receded into light like a memory, cigarette smoke trailing him. He was not a muscle. His power was a steadiness that implied resources. He had a business card on him that read Thomas Graham, security consultant. He did not speak like a hired thug. He spoke with the polished cadence of someone used to briefing executives. Daniel's first instinct was to shove a stack of papers into his bag. Leila's first instinct was to remain calm as a glass of water. The man stepped closer, took in their faces, and then smiled with the kind of patience that belonged to predators. "Miss Hart," he said, eyes on Leila. "You shouldn't play in other people's sandboxes." Leila's smile was an armor. "We found evidence of financial irregularities. We're documenting it." His voice turned quiet. "You might think you're helping. You might think you're right. But sometimes the cost is more than you can imagine." Tom cut the power from across the street with a clumsy switch, an action that bought a few seconds of confusion. The man cursed softly, the kind of curse that acknowledged annoyance but not fear. They ran then, shoving through a back exit and spilling into an alley that smelled of engine oil and old salt. Layla's bag had one of the folders torn by a door's edge. The item inside, an invoice connecting a sample date to a shell company, smudged into illegibility. They got away with enough. Copies of joisted emails, a ledger page with a partial account number. But they also left evidence that they had been there. They had inadvertently roused attention. After that night, things accelerated. The benign observations turned sharp. Someone left a different envelope on Daniel's stoop, this one containing a photograph of him and Leila inside the supply closet, grainy but clear, dated and time-stamped. They were under surveillance. "That means they have access," Daniel said, hands pressed to his temples. The feeling was one of tight-thumbed pressure, like holding an opened wound. Leila threw a jacket over her shoulders as if armor could be fabric. "Then we get louder," she said. "We go public." Tom wanted patience, strategy. You don't go public with partial evidence. You go public with conviction. You give it to someone who can't be bought. Leila chose a local paper with an editor who still believed in the job. Their meeting was clandestine, a midday coffee shop with thick cups and a man behind the counter who pretended not to notice their furtive whispers. The editor, a woman named Claire, listened with a mixture of gratitude and dread. She read the partial ledger pages, frowned at the photograph Daniel had obtained, and agreed to run a tiny piece, an investigative column that raised questions about Pierce Holdings' accounting and asked for public input. The story, when published, felt small and huge at once. Small because it was a single page in a paper running a dozen other columns. Huge because it opened a leash of responses. A man called, anonymously, with a voice that was too smooth. A former employee sent a message with the hint of a confession. A woman on the docks recognized a ledger entry as matching a shipment she had once prepared. The town stirred. And yet Gideon Pierce did not blow open like a balloon. Instead, he counseled silence and calm in his public statements, pledging transparency while hiring lawyers to prod at the publication's boundaries. It was the legal world's strangling hands. Claire's editorials were met with a quiet letter from Pierce's counsel advising caution. The paper had to consider libel. Meanwhile, the two men, clean-shaven and scarred-knuckle, upped their presence. Someone rapped at Daniel's window in the night, a silhouette moving past like a stagehand across a proscenium. One morning, Daniel found his lock picked. Another morning, someone had left a single absurd object on his steps. A snow globe with a tiny lighthouse inside, and a note tucked in the cardboard that read, "We see lights." The language sharpened. "Fuck them," Daniel said, low and dangerous, and instead of going to Tom or Claire, he found himself calling in a favor he had not used in years. An old friend who ran a small security firm in the city. The man, jarred, came in with a camera and a quiet assessment. The surveillance was professional, the men were not amateurs. Jarred installed a few cameras that were hard to locate, and Daniel sat in the shop at night watching the feed like someone waiting for a verdict. Leila tried to stay focused on the evidence. She became restless, sometimes unfathomably calm as she spent long hours with raw data. But there were moments when she was unguarded, and Daniel could see the truth of the cost she'd paid. One evening, over cheap takeout tea, she spoke of a night in which she had been pulled from a motel and driven to an industrial warehouse where paperwork was burned in the heat, and men joked like they were arranging a party. "I thought they would disappear me quietly," she said. "I thought if I went away long enough they'd find other scapegoats." Daniel listened and felt the sting that made him want to fix the world by tightening bolts. He wanted to take her into his arms and keep her in a room with only clocks and film strips and no danger. But Leila's life had become a matter of light and publicity. Hiding would not right what had been done. She needed to speak, to file things into the public ledger of truth. Daniel strove for patient strategies, she pressed for exposure. The tension between them, between safety and justice, wiggled like a loose wire. They had a small victory when an ex-employee of Pierce's approached them with a key. A ledger hidden in an old crate at the docks, a document listing sums funneled through unregistered accounts. He told them it was dangerous to speak, and that Pierce's men were watching. He gave them the crate's location, a derelict warehouse outside of town, and then, for reasons that remained opaque, he killed himself 2 nights later. They found him on the pier, his body a sad punctuation mark on a story that had no happy footnotes. The town said it was an accident. Daniel knew better. You could not find a cylinder of someone and say call it coincidence. The gravity of the stakes increased when their ally, Claire the editor, received a threatening call. A lawyer's voice on the other end offering a generous settlement in exchange for silence. The paper declined. Leila published a long-form piece anyway, anonymously at first. A piece that concatenated known facts and public records, framed by the ledger fragments they had. The piece named no one directly, but painted a picture that suggested a pattern of money moving to silence inconvenient lives. Gideon Pierce's response was surgical. He called a press conference the following week, highlighting his philanthropic contributions to the town's school and promising to cooperate fully with any investigation. His public face was generosity. His private machinery was viscous heat. That same week, Daniel's shop was broken into more destructively. A glass cabinet of antique cameras lay shattered on the floor, their lenses cracked like open eyes. Someone had tried to find what, in his mind, was the file of evidence he had been keeping. They had not found it. He had hidden the most critical pieces in the hollow cavity of an old lens board under the workbench, where nothing but a devoted amateur could think to look. But the message was clear. They would not be stopped by caution. Daniel's reaction was fierce. He wanted to push back with the same force. He wanted to set a trap and watch the two men reveal themselves in the act. Instead, they set smaller traps. Jard played cat and mouse with the surveillance, tracing where phone pings came from and mapping darkened cars. Tom used his old contacts to find lead lawyers who might take the case pro bono if the facts held. Claire's paper expanded its coverage, and pressure built. As pressure built, Leila made a choice that widened the conflict. She decided to publish the ledger online, a curated version that connected names to transactions, posted to a public forum where journalists often left their finds. The post went viral in a way that terrified and lifted them. Small websites linked to it, then regional papers, then a national journalist picked up the trail. Gideon's legal counsel scrambled. Law enforcement began to ask questions they had not asked before. The men who watched from the shadows did not escalate to violence immediately. Instead, they made public moves to discredit Leila. A smear campaign suggesting she was unstable, insinuations that she had doctored documents. She faced threads of her own past broadcast like evidence. They dredged up an old complaint that had been dismissed years ago and amplified it into a reason to doubt her credibility. Daniel felt the pressure in a way that made his chest constrict. He began sleeping in the shop in short naps, wakeful and ready, his hands curled as if around a tool. The candle's light became a kind of pulse that measured time. The nights when it burned bright were the nights he felt like he could hold the line. The nights it guttered were the nights he feared they would lose everything. Then came the night that split everything, not with a page but with a person. Leila's car did not return from a meeting with a source. She had texted Daniel an abrupt "be ready," and then silence. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Daniel felt something like a physical absence, a piece extracted from him. He went out into the rain, the candle at his back a beacon. He walked the shoreline calling her name like a bell. The next morning, Leila walked back into the shop with mud on her boots and a look that made Daniel's knees liquid. She had been followed, intercepted, and given a warning that was fleshier than paper. A quick shove and a shove of words at a convenience store, the kind of shove that implied someone could be hurt unless they stopped. She had kept her composure, she said. She had not told the police. She had learned something new in the night. Pierce's men had deep, almost legal ways of making threats. An unnamed friend losing a job, a quiet legal case opened against you as an inconvenience. She didn't tell Daniel everything. She never told him everything. There are some truths that are a kind of live wire, and she held them like a surgeon might hold a scared child's hand. She did, however, tell him enough, that her enemies had the town's institutions easier to bend than she had believed, that being right did not now guarantee safety, that leveraging the ledger could be the instrument that collapsed the house or the rock that broke them all. By then they were both tired in a way the uninitiated cannot understand. They were paraplegic to normal rhythms, sleep irregular, anxiety like a low, constant frequency. Their days bled into invention. Late-night surveillance, early-morning content uploads, frantic calls to lawyers. Friends rallied. Maria brought pies that warmed their hands. Tom kept a presence that was more guardian than detective. But the walls closed. The more sunlight they brought to the ledger, the more holes appeared in places they had trusted. Then, catastrophically, someone they thought an ally disappeared. The ex-employee who had promised them access to the crate at the docks vanished. His apartment was left empty, his phone disconnected, and his mother, an old woman, reported he had left town. The implication was ugly. The net tightened. One evening, when rain rimed the windows and the town smelled of wet wood, Daniel and Leila sat across from each other in the quiet of the shop. They had a map of all the moves they had made, all the files that had been saved, and a photograph still grainy on the table. "We're not kids," Leila said, "but we have to be smarter than them." Daniel wanted to say that he would turn himself against them in any way they needed. He wanted to lodge himself as a shield. But his fear now was more specific, that his quiet life, stitched with small acts of goodness, would be burned away like the shops they speculated Gideon had intended to acquire. Leila had a hunger to write things. Daniel had to make sure writing them did not cost innocent lives. They decided to escalate not by force, but by making truth a function others could verify. They fed the ledger to a journalist with a national platform, someone who had teeth and a reputation for not backing down. The journalist came down to town in a flurry of questions and polite threats, recording interviews and asking for corroboration. The national pressure created a fissure. Politicians who had been comfortable with Pierce began to distance themselves. Federal regulators called with inquiries. It felt, briefly, like the roof had opened and light poured in. But where light pours in, shadows rearrange. Gideon Pierce's public persona dissolved into legal attacks. He filed suits for defamation, threatened to sue Claire and the national journalist. He hired private firms to investigate the reporters for any misstep. He used money like a tidal wave, a pressure that could drown the smallest boat. The most dangerous moment, and the one that would define the arc of their lives, arrived not with the force of law, but with the quietness of a single night that smelled faintly of gasoline. Daniel woke to the smell and the sound of something small being moved outside. He crept to the window and saw, reflected in wet glass, a shape, the older man with the scar, kneeling by the shop door. He was placing something heavy against the front, a device like a clamp with a coil. Daniel felt the breath leave him. He called Tom. He called Jard. He whispered into the night like a man holding an animal. They found the device. A crude, homemade incendiary, wired to a cheap timer. Someone had intended to burn the shop down while they slept. It was not subtle. It was a message writ clearly. Stop or be destroyed. Daniel's world narrowed to a single motion. He picked up the incense-scented candle that had been his ritual for 7 years and held it like a lit compass. Leila looked at him then with an expression that held grief and fierce love. "We need to leave," she said. "Or we need to fight," he countered. The two options, flight or resistance, were not simply tactical. They were moral positions about what life and love meant in a world where institutions could be bent by money. They did both. They called friends. They packed essential documents into metal boxes and removed film negatives that were evidence. They sent copies of everything to multiple news desks for safety, a digital chain that would not be broken if one copy vanished. The town stirred as if sensing an approaching storm. On the night they found the incendiary device, the candle burned as if seeing its own shadow. Daniel, who had been living in routines since the first month Leila left, felt the weight of everything compress into the thin line between a flame and the wax. The choice that needed to be made was not only about law or exposure. It was about whether a man who had built his life out of careful, small things could be called to sacrifice them for a justice he had not believed in. He did not know, then, that the answer would require him to walk across a threshold he had avoided his whole life, to stand in a courtroom, to make an admission, to break the clock of his isolation. But as the candle flickered, and outside the men who watched slid back into their cars, a different kind of heat rose in Daniel. Not the panic of a shop on fire, but the moral warmth of someone who realized that waiting for the past to return was no substitute for living in the present. When the town woke, when Gideon Pierce held press conferences and lawyers filed motions, the battle was only beginning. The ledger's existence was a blade. It could sever corrupt ties, but it could also slice the hands that held it. The rising action was not a single crescendo. It was a layering of small decisions, betrayals of convenience, revealed loyalties, and the steady erosion of any sense of safety Daniel and Leila had once known. They had surfaced rusted truths, and in doing so, become the problem they intended to solve. When the evidence finally congealed into something prosecutors could wield, the scene that followed was a courtroom some 50 miles away in a regional city. Gideon Pierce, with his tailored suit and carefully neutral expression, stood accused of orchestrating a network that silenced inconvenient workers and funneled money into shell companies to keep stories buried. The ledger pages, annotated and cross-referenced with shipping manifests and bank records, were the heart of the case. Daniel sat in the back row of the little courtroom, hands folded into a kind of prayer that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with trepidation. Leila sat 2 seats away, shoulders squared. Tom was there, slouched in his pragmatic way. Maria came with a thermos of coffee and a look that said she would be present for as long as needed. Claire, flushed with the triumph of having told the story, fiddled with her pen. The trial felt like a triumph until it felt like something more dangerous, a public stripping that could make their lives raw. Gideon had resources. He had hired lawyers who had national reputations for making problems go away. The courtroom was a theater, and Gideon's team specialized in changing the play mid-act. They painted Leila as an obsessive reporter with a penchant for embellishing facts. They suggested that the ledger was contrived, that the numbers had been doctored, and that a journalist with a vendetta can always manufacture evidence if they have the will. Daniel listened as the defense team worked to make doubt its most polished weapon. He watched Leila take the stand with the same defiant grace as a woman stepping onto a stage she believed in. She testified with clarity, her voice sometimes strained but steady. She explained the provenance of the ledger, how they had found it, the ex-employee's crate, the ledger's copying process, and the chain of corroborating evidence. She told the story of the man they thought had been the dead end. Her testimony made the courtroom hush in ways Daniel had not seen since his father had once lectured at the town hall about civic duty. Then the defense pivoted in a way that Daniel had feared more than anyone could know. They produced a witness, a man who claimed to be Leila's former lover from the city, someone with a grudge. He testified that Leila had once tried to extort money from a developer by threatening to leak false information. The defense framed her as someone who would cross lines, blurring the edges between reporting and activism. The implication was lethal. If the main witness was discredited, the records could be explained away as artifacts in a lie. Daniel felt the room tilt. The man's words fell like hammers. The jurors' faces read like a ledger of small indifferences. He felt suddenly as if he were dangling above a void the size of the Atlantic. Leila, for all her poise, had a moment where the color slipped from her face. She fought to breathe and went on. "You can object," Tom whispered. His voice trembled like a plucked wire. But the rules of court, the choreography of law, had its own pace. The defense was slick. They had rehearsed creating alternative narratives. Then the defense did something cold and spectacular. They presented a private investigator's report containing the photograph Daniel had taken in the supply closet, the one with their faces, and an argument followed that suggested the photo had been staged. The implication was that Leila had planted herself in Pierce's office to take photographs, thereby manufacturing evidence. Daniel realized with the hollow clarity of a man dropped into a dark well that an hour of snap decisions, the night they had run from the closet, had left them with a photograph that could be read in ways they had never intended. He felt his tongue thicken against his teeth. At that moment, in a courtroom that smelled faintly of coffee and commission, the world became a simple test of whether truth could withstand the machinery of money. The defense attorney's eyes slid toward Daniel. "Mr. Mercer," he intoned, "were you aware of any falsification of evidence?" Daniel had no wish to be a dramatic figure. He had practiced silence for years, but silence in that moment would have been a betrayal. He had watched Leila return, He had stood by her when the shop was broken into, when the incendiary device was found. He had seen the scars of fear that lined her in the quiet times. Silence would be to lie by inaction. He rose, more to prove to himself he could. The courtroom focused on him like the eye of a storm. He had prepared no speech. He had, however, carried with him a small, plain, simple thing that would have legal implications, but felt like moral truth. The original envelope they had received, the one with the faint, oily smell that had said stop digging. He had kept the envelope among his other saved things, a paper that had begun to mean more than a threat. "I was there," he said. His voice surprised him, an even sound that did not tremble as much as he expected. "We were there. It wasn't staged. We took those photos to prove what we found. We copied what we found. We sent it to multiple places because we were afraid someone would try to discredit us." "Mr. Mercer," the defense attorney began, the slickness of his voice like varnish on wood. "I'm not a journalist." Daniel felt a flush of courage. "I restore cameras and watches. I know about truth because I see it in lenses. Those photographs show what we saw. If you want to say we staged something, you'll have to explain why the ex-employee burned the ledger the week before his death. You'll have to explain why people are missing. You'll have to explain why there are shell companies. You'll have to explain why a device was placed against my door." It was the rawest, uncalculated form of honesty. The judge fixed him with a look that was a mixture of admonishment and curiosity. The defense attempted to make the moment into something quaint. A local man with sentimental loyalties, not a witness with facts. But Daniel's statement had made something visible. He could feel it like a window that had opened and let in wind. But the most devastating moment came when Leila, called to the stand, told the court the story of why she had disappeared. It was not legally necessary, and Tom had advised her to avoid anything too redolent of the past. She ignored Tom's advice. She spoke about threats, about a night when she had been taken from a motel and driven to the industrial warehouses where she had seen documents burned. She spoke about a man with a scar on his knuckle, about how she had left town because she had believed vanishing would make the danger go away. And then she told them about the person who had made the danger personal. The defense, smelling blood, forced the issue by naming names through insinuation. They suggested she had once had a partnership, a romantic relationship, that had soured, that she had things to hide. Leila, with a steadiness that made some jurors blink, said nothing of private lovers. But she said, plainly, "I did what I thought would protect people. I left so Gideon couldn't get to them through me. I came back because those people were still being hurt." As if to sharpen the blow, the defense called an expert to testify that the forensic authenticity of the ledger could not be established beyond a shadow of doubt. They argued, an alternative chain, a hospital billing error, an accounting misentry. The courtroom swayed between the legal and the human. Then, in a twist neither of them had expected, an ally they had not known they had stood up in the gallery. The woman who had worked the docks, the one who had recognized a ledger entry and called Claire. She rose, shaky and older than Daniel had remembered, and in a voice that cracked the smoothness of the defense's construction, she testified to what she had seen. Trucks moving at odd hours, crates unloaded at night with men who didn't belong to the town, payments left in envelopes under orders that had nothing to do with legitimate business. Her testimony was small and imprecise and staggered under cross-examination, but the truth has a stubborn way of sticking when enough people have the same memory. The trial reached the point where words and evidence could not exist alone. Outside the courthouse there were rallies. People who had once been small and untethered found their voice. Small business owners told of lease terminations that had followed visits from Pierce's reps. The pattern was ugly and undeniable. Under pressure and the public gaze, a few of Gideon's more minor partners cut deals and began to talk. In the courtroom, the defense's narrative of doubt began to fray. The prosecutors, patient and precise, layered confirmed bank transactions and witness testimony like brick upon brick. The ledger's partiality became whole as bank records were subpoenaed, and a small-town accountant turned state's witness. Slowly, excruciatingly, the case built its skeleton. Daniel and Leila watched it daily, like two people waiting beside a river for floodwaters to recede. Then came the crescendo. a taped phone call surfaced. A conversation between Gideon and a man whose voice they all recognized. A man who had once been a fixer in their town, now living in suburbia with fancy wine and a practiced laugh. The tape, rough but damning, was a casual exchange about disposing of a problem when a person became inconvenient. It was not explicit, perhaps, in criminal law's strictness, but it was vivid. It was enough to swing public sentiment and to make the prosecution's push have teeth. Gideon's face, usually so composed, thinned at that moment. His lawyers prepared motions, but the tape was now public. The town watched like a chorus. The paper sold out. Daniel felt a tremor of vindication and fear in equal measure. The defense tried again, reaching for Daniel's past. They dug into his brother's history, a story Daniel had never wanted to bring out. When Daniel was in his 20s, his younger brother, Michael, had died under circumstances the town whispered about. He had been mixed up with bad people, with debts, with a few bad choices. The defense used the whispers to imply motive, to paint Daniel as a man who might have personal interest in seeing a developer fall. Daniel realized then how fragile reputations were, how easily one's private grief could be weaponized. Then the twist no one expected. The man with the scar, Thomas Graham, took the stand. Under oath, he sat and looked like a man called in to recite a script. The defense had called him to discredit Leila, to suggest surveillance and staging. Instead, when the prosecutor asked open-ended questions, Graham began, haltingly, to describe the operations he had once facilitated. Not the arson or the violences, he insisted, but the quiet machine of influence. He spoke of how businesses had been nudged, of payments funneled through LLCs, of a pattern where inconvenient lives became problems to be solved. He acknowledged working at the fringes of legality for years and said, with a cautious humility that made the courtroom lean in, that he had begun to feel he was in over his head. His admission was not total. He did not confess to all misdeeds, but he described methods and men who had worked like a web. He named names gently, and the prosecutor followed with a precision like a surgeon. There were still gaps, but in the law, gaps can be filled by patterns. Graham's testimony, more than anything, shattered the illusion that Pierce's network was invisible. It made it human and fallible. It made the ledger less like a conspiracy theory and more like a map. On the day the jury retired to deliberate, the air in the courtroom was taut. Gideon's suit seemed to shrink with the weight of press and public scrutiny. Leila sat a little paler. Daniel's fingers trembled on the chair. The candle, brought in by Daniel, incongruously, as a small human emblem, sat on the windowsill of the courthouse like a stubborn echo. Deliberations took days. The town held its breath. Then, finally, the jury returned with a verdict, guilty on several counts of corruption and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The room exhaled in a sound like waves breaking. Gideon's face remained stony. For men like him, there is always another avenue. But for the small lives that had been bulldozed under Prophet's feet, there was a sense of justice, even if incomplete. After the verdict, in a quiet corridor outside the courtroom, Leila and Daniel came together in a place that had nothing to do with publicity. They held each other like people who had been the dike holding back a flood. For a long moment, no words were said. Then Leila, in a voice that was unsteady with triumph and loss, said, "They'll push back." "I know," Daniel said, "but they'll be slower now." Her smile turned fierce. "I thought I knew how to be brave. I didn't know how to be brave and say I was scared." He kissed the crown of her head. "I thought I knew how to wait. I didn't know how to start walking." The climax was not, in the end, a single stage of victory or defeat. It was a window where truth and courage met under the law's imperfect but meaningful light, and a private reconciliation between two people who had named the cost and chosen to pay it together. Legal instruments could decide Gideon's fate, but the deeper conflict, the work of repairing what had been harmed, was just beginning. Yet even victory has a shadow. The verdict had been rendered, but new threats appeared like fog. Gideon's legal team filed appeals, wealthy allies whispered about alternative strategies, and the town, once galvanized, began to debate consequences. Leila's anonymity was gone. Daniel had stepped into a public space he had never wanted. They had won a battle, but had opened themselves to a world that required more of them than they had imagined. And in the hush after the verdict, when the press dispersed and the town returned to its daily hum, Daniel took Leila's hand and led her back to Mercer and Son. The candle on the doorstep flickered as if with approval. Outside, the ocean carried away the day's sounds. Inside, they had to learn how to live again in a life that had been reshaped by courage, truth, and the price those virtues exact. The weeks after the verdict were quiet in the way that follows a storm. There was a legal aftermath, appeals, statements from Pierce's lawyers, and a cascade of smaller hearings. There were also human consequences that the law could not touch. People who had been complicit, people who had been cowed into silence, and the shards of the community's trust that needed mending. Rebuilding would require civic work, apologies, and the slow, patient process of time. Daniel and Leila found that winning in court did not dissolve the private costs. Leila's face, though carrying a softer light, still had nights when she woke and relived the warehouse fire in flashes. Daniel, who had prided himself on skill and small craftsmanship, found himself in a world that demanded he be more visible than he had ever wanted to be. The shop, which had been their secret base, became a place of pilgrimage. People came to leave notes, to thank them, to ask for help. Maria's bakery thrived as if born on public goodwill. Their relationship, in the aftermath, moved into strange new configurations. Before, the best of them had been a habit of quiet gestures, leaving coffee, borrowing an apron, reading a magazine aloud in the late evenings. Now, their gestures had to account for trauma and public scrutiny. They were open in ways that once felt dangerous, and in that openness they discovered tenderness and limits. Part of the resolution was a decision they made about how to handle the archives, the documents, the ledger fragments, the photographs, and the threats. The town's historian, an old woman named Ruth who had a legal background and a tender respect for civic records, offered the shop space to house a public archive. It would be searchable and public. History, Ruth said, is where learning begins. If you hide what happened, it will happen again. Leila and Daniel agreed, and Mercer and Son became, partly, a public center for the town's reckoning. The archive was a slow-growing thing. Files scanned, truth cataloged with the awkwardness of real life. People came forward to tell their stories. Some were raw and immediate, some were too old to expect forgiveness. The archive became a place where the town could confront itself. But the most intimate resolution happened in the small domestic things. They learned to map the ways trauma surfaced. Daniel recognized that when the shop's glass went missing in a break-in, he felt the world raw and exposed. Leila recognized that sometimes her urge to run toward the fight was a way to avoid the quiet pain of recovery. They built rituals. Saturday morning walks along the shoreline, a small dinner at the shop when business closed, and the modest act of lighting the candle together every evening, not as an act of waiting, but as a daily choosing to keep a light in the world. Leila took on work that was less perilous than the investigations that had nearly consumed her. She started teaching investigative methods at the local college, training a new generation of reporters in ethics, documentation, and safety. The job allowed her to stay close to the work she believed in, while building a life that could, in theory, be less dangerous. She also met with victims' families, helped them collect records, and organized community meetings where she explained how to protect oneself from predatory entities that used money and law to silence. Daniel, whose hands fixed time and image, found his work changed. Clients came who wanted cameras restored not simply for their function, but to hold family memory. He started a photography class for teenagers, teaching them how to develop film and how to see. The class became a small community of its own, a place where young people found a lens through which to show their lives. His work at the shop became a conduit for repair in a deeper sense. He repaired watches and cameras, but he also listened to people's stories, offered advice, and made space for grief. They both faced practical changes. The town council, in response to the trial, introduced measures to regulate developers and set stricter transparency standards. It was a small victory. The laws would not remove all greed, but they made things harder for those who wished to profit by destroying small lives. The prosecutor's office created a liaison role with the local investigative journalists, an attempt at institutional collaboration that aimed to prevent future disappearances. But not everything could be fixed by law. The ex-employee who had died stayed a hole in the narrative, a life that could not be renamed. The man with the scar survived in their memories as a dangerous, human figure, someone who had been tempted by work that paid handsomely and who had made choices to keep harmony in his own ledger. Some men like Gideon retreated, others adapted. The economy shifted in small ways, and the town learned to be skeptical of quick contracts and smooth promises. Leila, for all her courage, discovered new vulnerabilities. There were nights when she would stare at the ceiling and see the warehouse fires again, and in the mornings she would wake with a concrete determination to be gentle with herself. She began to see a counselor who specialized in trauma work. It was part of the practical care she had avoided in the heat of the fight. Therapy, she found, was both humbling and liberating, like uncovering a lens on her own life and slowly cleaning it. Daniel, for his part, had to unlearn the idea that being private was the same as being safe. The court had demanded he step into a public role, and in doing so he found an unaccustomed power, that of testimony. He started a small volunteer program to help other small businesses understand how to secure their records and to train them in what to do if they received threatening letters. His vulnerability, once hidden, became a strength. Vulnerability, he told a town hall meeting one humid evening, is not weakness. It's the place where we can choose to act. Their love itself shifted. The passion that had once hummed in simple domesticity matured into a steadfastness that was both generous and sometimes enough. They had burned through romantic illusions and arrived, charred but honest, at a place where compromise was not surrender but collaboration. Leila learned to trust Daniel's steady hands. Daniel learned to trust Leila's restless courage. They found intimacy in the seemingly mundane. The way Leila hummed a tune while she reordered files, Daniel's small ritual of placing a film negative under a light to see what it would reveal. One significant test of their renewed life came when Gideon's appeal process dragged on. The legal battle had not fully ended, and the stress of public attention heightened. They had to make a decision about where to place themselves in the town's life, to stay at the center of civic engagement or to carve out pockets of privacy. They chose both. They remained active in pushing for transparency and in supporting victims, but created a carefully guarded domestic sphere. Locked doors, simple schedules, and boundaries they taught the press to respect. They also made a practical decision to protect the shop. Jard installed discreet security, and Tom organized a small neighborhood watch that looked less like a militia and more like neighbors paying attention. The candle, symbolic always, was now accompanied by practical measures: reinforced doors, insurance, and a network of people who would come if the shop was threatened. Winter came with a clean, quiet cold that made the town hush. Snow fell one morning and rimmed the skyline, offering a landscape that seemed more reflective than usual. The shop's windows fogged with breath. On a slow afternoon, warmed by a small kettle, Leila and Daniel sat on the floor with a pile of family photos and negatives they were helping to restore for a client. Daniel lifted a small photo, one of Leila laughing at a small fair years ago. The picture was slightly faded. He tapped his finger against the glass and saw his own reflection in her eyes. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, a question they had once avoided. Leila looked at him, an honest smile creasing the corners of her mouth. "Where would we go?" "Anywhere," he said. "Anywhere without Gideon Pierce and courtrooms." She laughed softly. "You mean anywhere that's not the coastline?" He smiled at that. He had always been a coastal man in his bones. There was a safety in water's constancy he liked. But the question had been a larger one. In that laugh, she answered him. "This is where people are," she said. "This is where stories need tending. It's messy and loud and full of trouble, but it's ours." They did not leave. Instead, they built. They used their public attention to start a small foundation that offered micro-grants to families who had lost a breadwinner to suspicious circumstances. They started a workshop for citizen journalists. The foundation's name was modest, the Light Project, and it focused on small, local acts that prevented abuses of power from recurring. Its first meeting was in Maria's bakery, a room full of coffee and people who had felt unheard. Through it all, Daniel's candle remained a quiet witness. Sometimes protesters gathered at the shop for a vigil, placing candles near his doorstep. Often they would leave notes of thanks on the door. Sometimes the flame would gutter in a storm, and Daniel would place another candle beside it. It was no longer a symbol of hope that someone might return. It was a torch they held for themselves and the community, a reminder of their obligation to keep watching and to keep resisting. Personal healing, however, required more than civic engagement. Leila and Daniel had to learn how to attend to each other in small ways. Daniel learned to say, "I'm scared," which Leila heard as permission rather than false bravado. Leila learned to ask for help when memories crowded her nights. They both rediscovered joy in ordinary things. A Saturday market, a quiet film developed under Daniel's tender hands, a walk to the lighthouse where they would sometimes stand quietly and watch the waves. Those small practices became their salves. Eventually, the legal smoke cleared enough for them to imagine a kind of normal. Gideon Pierce served time in a state penitentiary for corruption charges. Appeals had not exonerated him. Other complicit people faced smaller charges or firm repercussions. But the town's real reckoning, how you change a culture used to looking the other way, continued. Daniel and Leila married in the spring in a small ceremony on Whitaker Lane. It wasn't dramatic. It was held in the alley between the bakery and the shop, with Maria officiating and Tom offering a joke and a toast. The candle on Daniel's doorstep burned during the ceremony, a small, stubborn witness to what had been endured. People who had once watched from a distance came forward to stand near them. It felt less like a closure than a continuation. Vows meant to arrange ordinary life into a safer pattern. The marriage was not a fairy tale. There were moments of fracture, arguments about secrecy and publicity, bouts of hypervigilance, and occasional regrets about the cost of what they had done. But there was also an undercurrent of gratitude. For the people who had helped, for a community that had learned, and for the chance to love in a world they had helped make better. As time spun forward, Daniel and Leila learned to find the ordinary marvels of life again. They had dinner with friends, watched children play around the pier, and sometimes sat in the dark with a cup of tea and the candle burning like a small, stubborn heart. They were not naive. They knew that systems would always press against small towns. They knew that the work of vigilance would persist. But they also knew that the cost of turning away was worse. The archive grew. More people came forward. The Light Project funded a small scholarship for journalism students at the town's modest college. The shop flourished. Daniel hired a young apprentice who loved film almost as much as he did. Leila watched a new generation of reporters begin to ask the questions she had once risked everything to ask. The resolution came less as a single event than as a gentle accumulation of days, whereby life became, again, possible. The danger that had once arrived like a dark tide had abated enough to let sunlight across the tiles. The candle at the door no longer marked a vigil for a return. It signaled a daily choice to keep the world illuminated. And when, a year after the trial, Leila found herself walking with Daniel to the shoreline, she paused and lifted his hand to her lips. "We did it," she said. He looked at her with a slow, deep tenderness. "We did it together." She pressed her forehead against his. The ocean's music was a steady, forgiving witness. The town, with all its complicated history, had shifted in ways that would last. They had weathered the storm. The candle still burned, flickering sometimes, steady at others, like any honest life, not perfect, but tended. They had learned that love, like justice, required work, courage, and the willingness to stand in the light even when the world said staying visible would cost you everything. Years later, when people asked Daniel why he had kept the candle at the door even when fear made the nights long, he had a simple answer he gave more often than not. It's easier to keep a light than to hope for miracles. But the truth was subtler. The candle had been a proxy for patience and an instrument of attention. It taught him the habit of noticing, of looking up from a broken watch to see a face, and that habit had led him to keep watch not only for one person but for a town. It was a small, human way of refusing to let darkness be the default. Leila learned that courage was not a single moment of spectacle, but a series of small continuations. Showing up to speak at meeting after meeting, tending to the people who had been harmed, and stepping into quiet life in a world that sometimes preferred sensationalism. She had discovered that the price of not running was learning how to rest in safety, an odd, fragile skill. They did not pretend the world was now a simpler place. Corruption found new forms. Men like Gideon adapted or retreated, sometimes to return later in new clothes. The work of repair continued in committees and in courtrooms and in the slow, often thankless work of changing laws. But the town was better than it had been. There were more watchdogs and fewer people willing to be cowed. On quiet nights, when the sea rubbed the shoreline and the shop bell rang with an ordinary customer, Daniel and Leila would stand at the threshold together and blow out the candle. Then they would light it again. The act was not superstition. It was repetition with intent. It was saying, aloud in small ways, that they would keep tending the light. If anyone wanted the simple moral of their story, it might be: small acts matter, and love sometimes needs the courage of a witness. But there is also a more complicated truth they learned, that keeping a light for someone else can lead you to find out how fiercely you want to be seen. The candle had been a ritual for an absence, but in keeping it, Daniel discovered his capacity for action. Leila, in returning to the light, found the messy, beautiful work of rebuilding a life where the wounds could be named and the future could be chosen. Together they had learned how to keep watch and how to live. The candle flickered at the door, steady, waiting for nothing and everything, a small, human testament that some things are worth keeping alight. Because if you do, you might just be ready to meet the person who returns, or to become the person who returns to others when they need you most.